Welcome to 3 Lanes number 4. If you're listening to this podcast, the date that it comes out, we're doing it the week of Christmas, so it will be coming out on Thursday, the day after Christmas. Hopefully, you enjoy it. On this time around, I would like to talk about a camera that helped me get deeper into photography. I would like to say it's the Canon AE-1 program. Like a lot of people in the early 2000s, I had my point and shoots. I played around with cameras like that, but it wasn't until after getting into cars and watches that start to trying to display the details or tell a better story with images, because a lot of times, mainly because of Instagram, right? When Instagram was more about photos, it pushed me to start, creating something that was a little more pleasant to the eye, I guess. But I started playing around with a Canon AE-1 that was given to me by my father-in-law. And initially, my idea was to start with a digital camera, but this was what it was available. So I took it. I bought film from, I think it was a Walgreens or CVS. Started playing with it. Started taking some awful photos, and yeah, that's how my love for film kind of started again. But yeah, this camera, it's important, and I see it a lot with people using it, right? Like I see a lot of young people using it again. It's very portable. It's kind of heavy compared to new digital cameras, point and shoots, and whatnot, right? Everybody has a camera on their pocket, like we hear all the time. It's the phone, obviously, but there's something about this camera that it's pleasant and it makes it easier for people to use. But in this case, you know, I looked into it briefly at the beginning when I first got the camera, and I thought that it was gonna be the story was gonna be more something more revolutionary that happened, to create this camera. The first one with microcontrollers in it, with the first one really using technology for auto exposure and all that stuff. But honestly, I don't want to give a lot away, but well, I just thought it was gonna be bigger. That's all I'm gonna say. But for this camera, I would like to start back in April 1981. That's when this camera was introduced. So it was at the beginning of the 80s. 35 millimeter SLR. The predecessor was the Canon AE-1. It was developed for auto exposure, something that I believe the AE-1 camera that I've never touched, I never play with, um, did not have, right? The AE-1 did not have auto exposure. I'm going to touch on um, the different programs that the other one had, but it definitely did not have auto exposure. This was available on the Canon A1, which was regarded as a higher end camera, probably a professional. But the design for this camera started in 1974. It took 28 months to complete the design. And again, the key innovations that I want to touch on for this camera was microprocessors. They were integrated in the camera, and this was a key collaboration with Texas Instruments TI, and it was one of the first SLRs to use computer technology, which I think it's really interesting. It's the name of the Seiko escapes me, but at around that time, around the 80s, there was a Seiko chronograph which also my father-in-law also has, and he was the first chronograph to use uh modules like that. So technology was coming in strongly in the 80s, Another key innovation that the AE-1 program had was the simplified design. It eliminated around 300 parts, around 20 to 25% of the parts from the AE-1, original AE-1. Remove 300 parts and you have the AE-1 program, just because adapting all these microprocessors into the camera. Okay, we get into the multiple exposures, right? So we have, on the AE-1 program, we have auto exposure, shutter priority, and manual. Something that I believe the AE-1 only had shutter priority and manual. Some of the features and specs of the camera, it's the same Canon FD mount. It has a shutter cloth curtain focal plane. The shutter speeds were from 2 to 1/1000th of a second. So you can shoot pretty fast, right? Pretty fast movement stuff with the 1000th of a second, and you can have some long exposures with the 2-second exposure. It's good. It was really good for being a consumer camera. The viewfinder, a pentaprism. I'm not gonna get into specs of that because I don't completely understand them. The metering was a TTL, full aperture, center weight, and it average meter, right? So it takes the average of whatever you catch on the screen. It takes the average, and that's what it meters. The film speed that was uh, able to use on this camera is from ISO 12 to 3200. So from pretty low to pretty high. I don't know if you can still find ISO 12. Honestly, I don't even try. But the ISOs that I usually shoot are maybe 200, 400, and 800, right? The usual ones. The weight on this one I had to double check with my camera, because I found some places that said from 590 grams to 575, but actually the camera without the lens, it's 565 grams, 565. So it's light, just the camera, right? But when you add the lens, it adds quite a bit of weight, so it ends up being more like 600 something, mid 600s. But the development of the AE-1 program basically solidified Canon's position between the 70s and the 80s, or in, yeah, more on the 80s, right? Because the AE-1 was in the 70s. That one was a pretty good camera, but when the 80s hit, the AE-1 program was released. It was really a hit, for mainly for consumers, and we'll dig deeper into this. But yeah, it was a really good development, good positioning by Canon. What are the main difference between the AE-1 and the AE-1 program? Again, right, exposure modes. The AE-1 program added auto exposure, so basically you just have to put everything in auto, and the camera was going to do the math for you for anything. You don't have to. You basically have to match the, well, nothing really, right? Because if you put the shutter speed in auto, exposure in auto, the ISO is set, right? So then the camera is gonna do the rest. You don't have to basically worry about anything. You just it becomes a point and shoot at that point, which is really good if you're starting with photography. Especially, I know film can be intimidating at the beginning, but this is a good place to start. The viewfinder was different on the AE-1 to the AE-1 program. It was clearer. I think it was, I don't know if it was bigger, but it was definitely sharper. Focusing screens, there's 8 interchangeable focusing screens. When you try to focus, there's a little texture, you could say, that it aligns or misaligns when you rotate the focusing ring on the lens. The ISO selector was supposedly sturdier on the AE-1 program and less breakable, something that it seemed like had been an issue before with the AE-1. The design, since the camera was technically a little smaller, it was the design changed. The weight was lighter. because of the addition of the microprocessors. The display in the viewfinder, again, this is not talking more so much about the screen, but when I talk about the display in the viewfinder is when you are metering, the camera has LEDs. The AE-1 program has LEDs that shows you a green light if the metering is correctly, and a red light if you are over or underexposing the photo, which it turns out to be very useful if you rely a lot if you rely a lot on the in-camera meter, which I do when I use this camera. I try to overexpose. I mean, we're not gonna speak technicalities, but yeah, I try to overexpose a little bit depending on the film that I'm using. And again, it's better to overexpose, right, than underexpose a film photo, because you have more information there rather than not having any information. And finally, number 8, differences between the AE-1 and the AE-1 program is the AE-1 program had more accessories available for it, which I mean, I don't use many, but I think it would have been appealing back then. Again, we have the same mount and max shutter speed as the AE-1. That did not change. Next, we are moving to cameras, right? Camera manufacturers in the 80s. We spoke about what made this camera special, but we don't know what was the situation back then. Let's take a little dive into where was everybody back then, because nowadays, honestly, I shoot Fuji digital, and I don't really see well, I don't compare with the competition of the other cameras nowadays. I know Nikon is huge, right? Everybody's going crazy about the new Nikon. uh Canon is pretty big, but back then, I don't know, there were more camera brands, if you could say that. uh you had Minolta. I don't know if Minolta makes cameras anymore. Pentax still around. Sony was barely coming up. Olympus was a big player back then. Not so much now, right? They have the Micro Four Thirds that are pretty good, but I don't know if they're making anything big anymore. And not because they're not relevant, but mainly because I do not pay attention to that part, and I didn't want to go into how everything is in the current market. I wanted to go back and see how the picture was back then. So back then, Nikon had a dominant position between the 70s and the 80s. They were the market leader, mainly for the pros. They were known because of their quality and their reliability. Uh, they had some innovation going on, right? The cameras started to become modular, or not started. The cameras were modular back then, right? But the more accessories you have, like, are those backwards compatible? Are the lenses backwards compatible with everything that we have, right? They had integrated light meter and electronic shutter. They had a strong market share with Canon, right? The, between the both of them, they had 70% of the market. So that's how big these two companies were, but Nikon was significantly bigger than Canon. There was a technological transition that was happening between the 70s and the 80s, like we spoke. But yeah, the transition was going from everything manual to some electronic assistance. And Nikon was doing it, but everybody was doing it right at the same time. But Nikon seemed to be one of the pioneers on this. Uh, One of the things that maybe help Nikon also was that the conservative approach, like we spoke, they had a backwards compatibility, sorry, with the F mount. So a lot of the cameras that they had share the F mount, and that helped them, keep a lot of their customers. Um, but what about Canon, right? Where was Canon? in this during this time. If Nikon was the biggest one, Canon was the second one. But what made Canon so or special at the time? I'm not gonna say so special because we'll see how the story evolves. Canon was strong and he was evolving. He was the next in line, challenging for the pro market, but they were not the main dog, right? Like the big guy was Nikon. They were an innovation leader, though. Canon was innovation leader for consumer cameras. They had auto exposure, metering, motor drives, autofocus, something that Nikon stayed behind a little bit when it comes to the autofocus. That hurt them a little bit. They were increasing the market share with consumers, not with pros, but consumers. The 80s is was an inflection point. Uh, Again, when we're talking about technology, right? That the technology was being a big thing back in between the 70s and the 80s, and whoever embraced it first seemed to be the one that was going to have an advantage. In general, actually, uh, Canon was pretty diverse, right? They had their autofocus progress that helped them a lot, and they also diversified into camcorders. One question that's worth asking is, how was this electronics advancement possible, right? And here's where TI enters. TI was the world's leader producer of semiconductors, calculators, and digital watches back then. They were in uh, spearheading an innovation. They were aggressive. Uh, they were the main competitor in the U.S. with Japanese companies. But surprisingly, they were not a leader in microprocessors, which is the main component that we're talking about here. Uh, they were memory chip pioneers, with the DRAM in 1974. But what were the triggering factors for this camera to be made between these two? And well, I think the main one is the tech advancement. The progress in electronics back then between the 70s and the 80s, it was a huge opportunity. And it was basically who positioned themselves better at that time with that technology. Something that we might see now with maybe AI, right? I don't know, artificial intelligence. They're a huge thing right now, and it depends who, if everything goes according to what it seems planned, who positions themselves in a better spot, then they might get ahead from out of all the companies that we have out there. The same can be said with cars and electrification, right? Whoever positions themselves better. Tesla was ahead for a long time, but it looks like Chinese manufacturers catching up. But let's not get off track. The triggering factors again. Uh, it was also the elimination of parts, right? Making cost and production easier for themselves, for Canon. We're gonna talk about the challenges soon, but some of these things and incorporating the technology into the camera made the design and the quality of the cameras more accessible to amateur photographers, and made it easier for the company to make this actual cameras. Some of the byproducts that happened because of the changes on this camera, meaning the microprocessors, it was the affordability again. The cost for consumers was lower. The ease to use, it was so much easier to use. Like I explained, if you put everything in auto, the camera becomes a point and shoot. Um, the automated production, they develop an automated production for this camera to be made, so the labor cost went down, the consistency in production went up. Yeah, I know it's not like a Leica, right, made by hand, but again, it was something to help people to get into photography back then, and it achieved the objective. The usage of plastics, it became a huge thing on this camera specifically because it made it lighter and cheaper. I know it's kind of heavy, but still, right, it's lighter and cheaper for what other cameras are. I think I have a I have a Pentax Spotmatic, and it's pretty much around the same weight than the AE-1 program, and it's a definitely smaller camera, but it's around the same weight, and but the Spomatic is fully manual, and it's crazy how the elimination of parts. I mean, it's obvious, but at the same time, crazy how a smaller camera can weigh almost the same as a bigger one, just because the other one has more plastic in it. Let's move to the challenges that Canon encounter creating the AE-1 program. One of them was the need for more powerful microcomputers, meaning they had to develop some new stuff to make the adjustments or make the camera work as they intended. The circuit design added some space constraints. Yes, you got rid of some mechanical parts, but at the same time, you're adding more electronic parts. And if the body is smaller than the AE-1, then that definitely becomes an issue, depending how big this printed circuit boards are, right, and how many components are there. Uh, Again, the type of chips that they had some specialized chips. I can give you more information about this if you're interested. I don't want to touch on it because it's a lot of nerdy stuff, and I don't want to touch too much on this because it becomes too nitty gritty and I don't know, man. I don't think anybody is completely interested in how these chips work. So, but if you are, just hit me up and I'll let you know. Uh, the other thing that they encounter with this bunch of chips that they added, it's the noise. So any electronic pulse that you have within the camera, the camera is using batteries and it's using electronics to create the photos that you shoot. Any type of electronic pulse can become what they call noise, and this noise can confuse the camera and make it malfunction. So that's one of the things that they encounter, one of the biggest challenge that they had. Another one was the inspection process. You're not inspecting a mechanical camera, now you have a electronic camera, and you need the expertise to basically go through an inspection station and know where the electronics are okay, where basically, if we say, instead of a thread of a screw, right, inspect the screw, you know what's right, what's wrong. But on the PCBs, you have to check the soldering, you have to check all the components that are okay, and so on and so forth. They also develop a new technique, chip on board. I think they developed it, I'm not completely sure. Somebody fact check me here, but the chip on board was something new. Chip on board is a technique that basically, instead of having a package like this complex BGAs that Apple is developing nowadays, they had the components and they would put them on the board, basically attach them to the board, and then they would put a resin on top of it to make it less or fire resistant, you can say. It would dissipate heat better, and this resin just looks like a black dot. Again, it's like a piece of rubber on the board. It doesn't look sexy, let me tell you that. But yeah, those were the challenges that they encounter. And honestly, the AE-1 program, I thought it was going to have a more exciting story. And yes, the intro of it challenged Nikon. It did challenge Nikon, but it did not hurt him. They still remain the main guy in the photography space. But one thing that the AE-1 program did was disrupt. It did disrupt the industry. It made it more affordable for people to have cameras, easier for them to use high quality cameras, help with electronics, easier to shoot, film. You know, it was an easier way to get in, kind of like having a phone in your pocket now. It's not the same quality as a camera, as a professional camera, but it's a phone photo can be really really good. Uh, it can be said that Nikon, right? They develop the FG, and they competed with the AE-1 program. They launched the FG, I believe, in 1982, a year after Canon launched the AE-1 program. But it was nothing crazy. It was the usual competition that we see nowadays, but it was not as disruptive as for example electric cars, the electrification, right? How everybody's trying to catch up, how the oil crisis affected Volkswagen in the last episode. We saw how they had to develop the GTI to, or the Golf, to overcome the difficulties with the Beetle. Thanks so much for tuning in. This was the AE-1 program, or the story of the AE-1 program. If I skipped some information that you might want me to add, or you think there was something relevant that I skipped, please let me know. Comments are open here, social media, and the website 3lanes.com. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you next time.